Thanks for joining us on this new season of the Future of Faith podcast. Future of Faith develops and curates resources to help connect current and future generations with their faith lives. We do this through listening deeply, gathering information with wonder and curiosity, and scaling meaningful relationships. Visit futureoffaith.org for more information and to discover sacred tools for courageous connection. Well, welcome to the Future of Faith podcast. My name is Greg Arthur, and I am part of the team here at Future of Faith. And in this season of the podcast, we are listening with great curiosity to the stories of faith leaders from across the diverse and the beautiful body of Christ. We want to really learn what God is doing in the world, how are people pursuing their faith, and how might we cultivate the practice of sacred listening in our own lives and certainly in our communities. And my guest today is Dr. Kristina Lizardy-Hajbi, and we are going to talk about trends in congregational life and pastoral leadership and what she's seeing and hearing from all the people she works with. So, Kristina, thank you so much for being our guest today.
It's great to be here.
If you're not familiar with Kristina's work, she is the Associate Professor of Leadership and Formation and the Director of Vocational Formation Office at the Iliff School of Theology in Denver, Colorado. In addition, she coordinates the certificate in Latinx Studies for the Iliff University of Denver Joint PhD in Religion. Boom. You have, like, in the world of titles and things, that's an impressive array of words that are all jammed together in your vocational titles.
Yes, it's right. It's a lot of titles.
It's good. Her work involves teaching and research interests include organizational leadership, liberative and decolonial approaches to ministry, intersectional and contextual pedagogical practices, and applied research methods. Author of numerous books and articles, all of which I've listed out and linked in the show notes and on Substack, so you can find that. She's also an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ and has included work in leadership, denominational leadership and research. You have a wide array of experiences and people you've been working with that we want to really tap into to understand what is happening in congregations, what's happening in pastoral leadership. We're trying to listen and figure out what's going on. But before we get to that, we want to listen to you. And the question is, what's the best book or movie or TV show you've enjoyed in 2025? You've said you're on sabbatical this year. It's been a great year. I hope you've enjoyed something. What have you enjoyed?
Yes, I have enjoyed many things being on sabbatical. I will tell you that, Greg. I think for me, the most impactful thing that I have read this year, and I have been recommending it to everyone who's read the book upon my recommendation has said this has been transformative for me. So if you are not familiar with Ruha Benjamin's book, Imagination, a Manifesto, read it. It is so lovely and so needed for our time. It's a quick read. It's a public-facing book. She's a sociologist at Princeton University, studies race, technology, and medicine, and the sociological intersections between those things. But her work around imagination and her thesis is that we live inside other people's imaginations and other people's and organizations' imaginations that aren't necessarily life-giving or liberative for us. And she uses examples of technology about, the imaginations of tech giants and tech bros and how they imagine humanity in the future and how that is actually really limiting and creates greater inequalities, especially for people of color, marginalized people. And so she talks about historically the ways that communities have moved outside of the societal imagination that has been directed for them to create their own imaginative freedoms and possibilities. So I couldn't say enough good things about the book, but please do check out that resource. She also was the guest lecturer for the Tanner Lectures at Harvard University. And so if you go on YouTube, it's a 2-part lecture series. And she basically outlines sort of technology and this book that she's written, as well as her other research in those lectures.
Excellent. Well, I will find links for both of those things and throw them in the Substack. So a reminder, if you're listening on another platform, go sign up for the Substack because then you get the links to everything. So we'll put those in the show notes because those sound like a really interesting read and really interesting conversations. And I'm going to go buy the book after we're done. That sounds wonderful.
Awesome. Awesome.
Well, I invited you to join me today because you have been personally and working with others who have been studying trends in congregational life and leadership, especially amidst the culture changes of the past few years, which we don't have to go down the list, but there's been a pandemic, there's been radical changes socially, culturally, technology. There's a lot going on within that. And we're hoping that you can help us maybe understand a little bit of what's happening on the ground in congregations, how leaders are adapting, and maybe going back to this theme of imagination, how we can expand our imaginations for creatively engaging in our local communities, because we're really concerned about the future of the church and the future of faith, and we want to engage within that. So with your background and the work you're doing, can you give us a little overview of like your actual hands-on experience with some of this and what's shaped and formed you in these studies and in your leadership roles?
Yeah, sure. So as you mentioned, I'm an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. And so I have been almost with the UCC for 20 years as a minister, doing different kinds of ministries. I have been doing those mostly outside the local church, but I study the local church as
Mm.
my as my main context of inquiry and research. Just to back up a little bit, though, my own religious background, my parents were raised Catholic, and my dad, when I was 6 months old, attended a Nicky Cruz revival, outreach revival, and he became a born again Christian. So I was raised evangelical, non-denominational, Pentecostal, in sort of various sects and traditions. And so I found the United Church of Christ when I was in seminary. I had served as a associate pastor for a year. I was 22 years old and realized that I had no idea how to work in a church or be a pastor or do ministry in context beyond the campus context, which I was doing in undergrad ministry. And so I went to seminary, and I went to seminary at Iliff School of Theology as first generation college graduate, a Latina who grew up in Southern Colorado, Northern New Mexico, but is a Boricua by ethnicity. I'm a Puerto Rican. And so, went to seminary, was transformed by that experience, and then found the United Church of Christ as my ministry path and became ordained. And I was ordained into undergraduate student affairs multicultural ministry. So did that for a while. And while I was doing that, I got my PhD in educational leadership research and policy. So I don't have theological or religious PhD, but I am a minister and I have experience. And from there, went to work for my denomination. So directed a research office, did that for 7 years, worked with faith formation research and then research for the whole denomination. And then at that point, sort of thinking about, well, how do I want to be embedded more in community and less on a national setting, right? Less travel, less sort of keynote speeches, workshops, that sort of thing. How can I be known and how can I be in a community of people that know me? And so I found a position at Iliff School of Theology, applied for it, my alma mater. And I've been a member of the faculty for 8 years now in those various roles, but I'm a tenured faculty member, great, wonderful colleagues there. And I get to work every day with students who are asking important questions about the future of the church, about ministry and their own place in the church, and asking, do I have a place in the church? And what is the future? And how do I help even co-create the future of the church?
Yeah. I have so many curious follow-up questions, but I'm going to limit myself so we can talk within that. Could you just give us a little bit of understanding of, with that unique background of both academically, socially, ethnically, from your family origin within that, what were some of the, what do you feel like that has given you eyes for, or what perspectives has that helped you bring into this really vital work?
That is a great question. And I've thought a lot about that because I exist sort of at the margins or as a bridge between many different sort of backgrounds, cultures, ethnicities, religious traditions, denominations, all of that. And in working with students around what is your vocation? How do you understand your own sense of calling and purpose? I've begun to understand my own sense of call, who I am as a human being, who God created me to be, as a CCMM for short. That stands for Creator, Connector, Misfit of Multiplicities. And so someone who can see one side, see another side, see all the sides, and see ways that they might coalesce and ways that they might be disparate. But, and I've written about this too in work on vocation, but thinking about that and embodying that can often be a challenge. but I see it as a real gift for who I am because I
Mm.
automatically sort of live into worldviews and embody worldviews that aren't necessarily the dominant worldviews in my own
Mhm.
institution, in my church. But I'm able to live in multiple worlds and see the ways that those worlds can come together.
Does that show up then in some of your pedagogy as far as how you're working with your students and how you're shaping them and how you're helping them to understand themselves? Like what does that look like on a practical level as a teacher and instructor running programs?
Yes, absolutely. It looks like lots of conversations and lots of listening. And so thinking about listening as a sacred act, right? And
Yeah.
how we do that. But then even mirroring back to students what I heard, what I see, and what I notice. And oftentimes, the students that I work with in particular come from backgrounds where their own religious traditions of origin have harmed them in
Mm.
some way, and they're seeking meaning and maybe a theological home elsewhere.
Mm.
But what they often bring with them in coming from those kinds of traditions is a lot of trauma and a lot of harm that they need to work through. But also, in some ways, if the traditions have been very rigid, that sort of same sense of rigidity and
Mm.
binary thinking, but then applied in a more progressive liberal
Mm.
context, because Iliff
Mm.
is a more sort of progressive liberal school, but yet they still apply those sort of frameworks that are very binary. Well,
Yeah.
justice looks like this. It does not look like this. And
Mm.
I say to students often, well, is justice really justice if it's only your version,
Mm.
if it's only how you understand it to be right or wrong? And it's certainly not social justice because social implies more than yourself. But I would
Right.
argue that justice is a communal co-creation. And so you have to work within communities and
Mm.
negotiate tensions and differences. And so I just try to journey with students where they are, and I also challenge them in those
Yeah.
ways. I ask questions that maybe they don't want to hear, but I believe in being direct, and I believe in that's the purpose of education, is to
Yeah.
challenge, is to help us to grow, to transform, and to be formed as a continual process throughout our lives.
And I love the beautiful way in which you articulated that because there has been a struggle in as we intentionally create safe spaces for a multiplicity of voices to be heard, which thanks be to God, we're trying to do that.
Yes,
Right,
yes.
right. Like we're glad this univocal reality of education and everything's top down and you're just there to listen and absorb and conform to this. There's been dramatic shifts in a lot of educational environments trying to do that. But one of the fears or one of the compromises or one of the struggles perhaps has been how do we still help people grow and move beyond just where we are and become something more? The educational experience is a transformative experience. And hopefully in the best scenarios, it can be a redemptive experience. It can be a reconciling experience. It can be a healing experience as you're in community and relationship with others and doing that. So it just really excites me to hear you articulate how the listening creates the trust, the ability to then move into conversation,
Mhm.
challenge, because there is trust for that.
Yes, absolutely. And sometimes trust, I mean, in an educational context, we work within a structure. And so sometimes trust is held by the institution in my role as a faculty member. And sometimes that very same role creates mistrust,
Mm,
right? You don't know me, you don't know my experiences, you don't know
yeah,
where I come from. And so the conversation and the listening and what happens in between the spaces of the structures and the positions that we hold is really where true meaning making and transformation can happen.
yeah. Wow. I have lots more questions on that, but I'm going to move into congregational life
Yes,
and
yes,
trying to see what else we need to learn here.
yes.
So what are some of the trends that you've observed, studied, found people's research on around congregational life and pastoral leadership and the changes that have been taking place over the last, I don't know, let's call it decade, post-COVID? You can give us the knowledge within that, but help us understand a little bit of what's been going on.
Yes. So I just had the great pleasure of editing a volume of the Religions Journal on emerging trends in congregational engagement and leadership. And as you mentioned, it's an open source ebook. You can access at any point, but this volume constitutes sort of the latest research that's happening
Mm, mm,
around congregational life. what's been happening perhaps, but what's happening now in the moment and how congregations are responding to it. So I sort of start with the question of, well, what isn't happening in congregational life? Because right?
Right.
And congregations are mirrors of society at large. We live within culture. And so as culture shifts, congregations shift or they don't shift. And there's a continuum about how congregations relate or don't relate with culture. But social impacts that have happened over the last decade, including COVID, our increasing political divisions that we're facing,
Hmm.
increased climate change effects and impacts that are happening in our communities and across the globe, increasing diversity and migration patterns that are either being exacerbated or shifting. And this, again, is happening globally. We see it in Europe. But we also see it in the US and we see it in other places in Central and South America. This is impacting staffing and vocational shifts in churches, right? Who are these individuals who are leading congregations? How are they equipped? And what are the trends around staffing that we're seeing? More part-time ministers, bivocational, co-vocational ministers. How is that impacting finances, facilities, and then sort of all of the things that we're seeing related to broader shifts in our understandings of who we are as individuals, who we are as a society, what is the meaning and purpose of life, and how do we be in community with one another amidst rising individualism, colonial legacies that we're dealing with, and continuing colonial legacies that the U.S. in particular is. I
Yeah.
just came back from spending 8 days in Puerto Rico, which is where my grandparents were born, and Puerto Rico still continues to be a colony of the United States, and the challenges that Puerto Ricans are facing are huge. And there's a lot going on, and the way that those churches are dealing with those things in Puerto Rico is amazing to behold and also very daunting. So we're all sort of facing a lot. And so there are folks who are doing research in understanding how congregations are responding and how congregations are transforming, right, or adapting to these kinds of shifts or meeting the needs of individuals and communities in a different way than they maybe did 10 or 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah. Let me dive into a couple of those with specific questions to see if we could. First, because of political narratives going on, there has been a lot of talk around and a revelation around how little people understand the scenario of Puerto Rico and its existence in relation to the US. You have some ability to speak into that from the church's perspective and whatever. Can you just double click on that for a minute for us? And you were there, you're on the ground with everything that's happening, all these conversations. Help us understand the context that people are doing ministry in there, how they're responding to it. Because I think it's just, you have the ability to speak into that in a way that I don't. So I'd love to hear.
Yes. So many people would consider, and I think this is true, Puerto Rico is the oldest colony on the planet. First colonized by the Spanish and in 1492 when Christopher Columbus came to Hispaniola. And then in the Spanish-American War at the turn of the 19th century, when Spain surrendered to the United States, as part of their surrender, they gave Puerto Rico and Guam to the United States as part of the negotiation of that surrender. But nonetheless, Puerto Rico became a part of the United States and is now a colony of the United States, as well as Guam and several other islands that are part of the Caribbean and the Pacific. So that's sort of the short version of that. So Puerto Ricans were granted a limited form of citizenship through the Jones-Shafroff Act, saying that Puerto Ricans could serve in the war. It was the beginning of World War I. Bodies were needed to serve in that war. And so Puerto Ricans were granted citizenship largely, scholars say, to serve in that war. Puerto Ricans do not vote in presidential elections, and they vote in local Puerto Rican elections. So there's a long history there, and there's even a history of different There was a point where Puerto Ricans could not fly the Puerto Rican flag, and that was banned. And so there have been
Mm.
several efforts over the last 125 years to sort of quell independence movements in Puerto Rico. Um, and as we currently stand, it is financially dependent on the United States in many ways, and has been also financially and economically hampered by different movements of the United States. So church is there. And there's a broad diversity of churches in terms of sort of theological belief and understanding. There's Catholics, there's evangelicals, there's mainline Protestants, but the configuration is a little bit different in Puerto Rico than it is in the US. But still, there are ties to the mainland. I was just there doing a visit to a school who was seeking accreditation. And so I was there doing an
Mm.
accreditation visit for our big theological school accreditors. But the challenges that they face are very different than the challenges that folks face on the mainland.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's a short history, a
no,
short
that's
sort of
really,
version.
I mean, I knew most of that, but even hearing it articulated that way was helpful to me. But I find that in conversations, as I'm trying to listen to people and we're talking about issues that are coming up or statements that are made by our government around Puerto Rico, it is clear that some literally do not know the connection between the two and the colonial relationship and how decisions impact that, nor the citizenship status of Puerto Ricans with it. So it just seemed like it was worthwhile to mention that and to
Yes.
gain some perspective for that. With congregations, especially thinking about the last 5-6 years post-COVID and polarization and some of the economic changes, you mentioned changes in vocation, changes in building, changes in programming. What are some of the actual trends you're seeing within that as far as how people are adapting to this rapidly changing environment?
Yeah, I think so. So I'll just start by saying we live in a world where we want institutions to live in a state of permanence and stasis. And
Mhm.
I think churches are beginning to understand and realize, many congregations are beginning to realize that that is not the reality. Change is all around us, change is happening all the time. And how we respond to those changes and how we meet those needs is it's very much similar, I think, to how the church has functioned throughout history. But I mean, the church has been a church of change, sometimes behind culture, sometimes ahead of culture, sometimes with culture. So churches constitute the span of that sort of continuum of how they respond and how they change. Let's just take one example. So COVID. Churches were more open to change. And this is research that's found in the book that was done through the EPIC project, the Exploring the Pandemic Impact on Congregations. It's a 5-year research project to sort of track congregational life in the U.S. during COVID and post-COVID. Churches were much more open to change prior to COVID, but then it increased significantly during COVID, 2020, 2021. But now in 2025, we're seeing less of a desire to change. And I think sometimes
Mm.
change gets forced on us. So because of COVID, people
Yeah.
had to learn new technological skills. They had to figure out how to reach people who were not reachable in person, who weren't coming to the church building. And so, of course, one's own tolerance for change
Yeah.
increases when you're trying to do those changes to meet real needs. And then when there's sort of a time of less change in those immediate needs, I call those shocks. When there's
Yeah.
less of a shock to the system, then change kind of begins to slow down. And that's what we're seeing in the research. I will say that there are cases of congregations making huge adaptations, though, in these last 5 years. I mean, we have more hybrid or online congregations and ministries than we have ever had at any point in history. We have different staffing models. More technological expertise was needed. And so staffing was reconfigured in order to meet those needs. And so we see people now being tech ministers, right? And having the title of tech minister. And what does that look like? And there are now questions of, well, what is membership? What does it mean to be a member if you're only a person on a screen
Right.
every week? Are you still a participant? What does participation mean to be a part of a community? So all of these things churches are trying to grapple with and sustain and figure out, how do I continue to be in this time? So that's just one example. But I
No,
think churches have withstood a great amount of change and have begun to adapt in really helpful and important ways.
yeah, and a couple things you named there, which I would relate to deeply as a local church pastor. are, one, the tolerance for change and what happened when people reached the end of their tolerance for change. I have joked with pastors in my particular context that it felt like all of the people who were looking for a church got put into, like, it was like Boggle. They all got put into a shaker, and it got shaken up for 2 years, and then everybody resettled, and a lot of people resettled somewhere differently. And I'm not even sure people could articulate why, but my observation was, I pastor a church that has always been more innovative and outside the box. And people who found us and connected with us were really attracted to, I mean, we meet in an old lumberyard warehouse that we converted. We
yeah.
were deeply engaged in justice ministries among the sexually vulnerable and exploited, working around the globe, really open our partnerships, just a different sort of posture in what we did. And a lot of people were very interested in that because it was they were almost always emerging out of a more traditional model of church. Engage that. We found that a lot of those people 2 years or year and a half into the pandemic returned to what was deeply familiar. The thing they had longed to escape and have something different from went, they, you know, and in my mind, went backwards. It's not, I don't mean that with any sort of criticizing them, what they're saying within that. What I mean is that they went to, this was the same. And it's still the same as it was when I left it. And there's no innovation taking place. There's no real change in that. And they were craving in the world of rapid change stasis.
Yes.
And as people were drawn to that, I just had to go, if that's what provides you comfort, thanks be to God, I'm glad you're there. You've found it. But really found that the tolerance for change, when people hit it, you knew because their behaviors changed. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I think those are the moments where the tethers of community and ritual and church life really center and hold what is meaningful. So it's not that people are returning to tradition perhaps out of a sense of nostalgia, although nostalgia can be part of it, but it's sort of the question of what grounds me when everything else around me is shifting. And for many of us, that is ritual, that is one another. You know, human connection, whether that be over a screen or holding someone's hand. You know, I think connection and ritual are two of the great gifts that we have as a church that we can give to the world, right? And that we give within the world. In these particular ways. And I think it's hard for some people to decouple perhaps cultured norms from the meaning behind those norms. So you have folks in churches who are like, if you do not sing this hymn every Advent or, you know, during the Christmas carol sing, then like all is lost, right? But the question is, what is underneath that? Right. What are the memories and the stories underneath that? And
what meanings attached that for you personally, for your own experiences? Like what are you craving in that?
Right. And even inquiring into that deeper sense, like what is it about that is meaning? Well, it's a connection to my parents. It's a connection to my community of origin, and say, okay, well, what are other ways that we could honor that? And what are other ways that we continue to maintain that sense of community in the space, even as sort of technical things around us change, even as we're doing hybrid worship, even as we're doing those sorts of things. So I think those are some of the questions about how we respond to change. One of my most...
I have an example of that, if I can offer, that I think ties exactly what you're naming. So like I said, our church, we always approach things sort of differently. And for some people, the fact that we are not a participant in civil religion, right? We don't fly American flags in our sanctuary. We don't do things that are participation in American civil religion because that's just not our identity. People who want to do that are able to do that wherever they want to. That's not the issue. But for some people, because their experience of the congregational life has been an integration with Christianity and American civil religion, they've missed those aspects of it. And it used to be that I was probably hostile in some regards. I've grown a lot. The Spirit's been at work with me. But in trying to ask the question curiously about the meaning of those things. So we have some retired military people who, especially around Memorial Day, came to me with an asking, will you do something and pray for and recognize the people who have been lost, people I served with, meaning, and this was a significant part of their life that they brought into their pursuit of God, that they wanted to be part of their congregational life. And it was so easy to make space for that and to honor that and to do it in a way that made sense for us, because we got to the thing that was beneath it. They didn't ask us to put up an American flag or to have a Memorial Day service. What they asked for was, can we acknowledge this experience and its meaning and bring it into our life? And in doing so, made our community richer by doing that too. So I think that's an example of what you're naming.
Yes, absolutely. There's some great sociological research that was recently done around that example of flags in congregations. My colleague and friend, sociologist Kevin Doherty at Baylor, just I think published an article just a year ago, just sort of looking at that. But those are those deep, meaningful things where congregational leaders hold the potential to really open up and mediate that space, right?
Mm.
And to search for the meanings underneath those sorts of symbols, those sorts of questions around, can you pray for so-and-so, or will you pray for so-and-so? And I think, I mean, that's happening in all sorts of ways in our congregations. I think of most recently Charlie Kirk and people wanting to pray for Charlie Kirk and his family and all this. And I know many in my congregations who were challenged by that, right?
Yeah.
And so thinking about all of those things, how do you as a leader mediate this sort of, what is the meaning and how do we theologically frame those? That is really the holy and the translational, I would say inclusively translational work that pastors and congregational leaders need to attend to, most importantly, right? It's translating the tradition and the beliefs and the practices of Jesus into our current context. And how do you do that faithfully is a big challenge.
And this is, tying back into this theme of listening, this is where I found it very helpful in studying contextual theology, that the idea and the practice of shaping a local theology, and that's actually what the pastoral experience is doing. And in order to do that, you are having to listen so well to your community, to their experiences, to what they value, to understanding the why behind that, much like you were doing with your students, interacting with that, trying to shape something together from that, right? Because sometimes you're bringing that into conversation with the kingdom of God, or maybe aspects of God at work that they haven't experienced before, or an increased diversity within their congregation that they're not used to. But you have to be a really good listener to do that. And if you all learn to listen well together, it does become sacred. It is a holy thing for a new expression of good news and faithfulness to emerge from people who bring their lived experiences together and listen together for that purpose.
Yes, absolutely. And I work with a lot of students who go into particular contexts with particular values and sets of principles and ways that they understand what justice is, and have a very difficult time in a congregational context say, well, they don't agree with me, or they're not doing this the way I would do this. Well, of course they're not. Like, it's a context, and you have to come and enter into a context with a little bit of humility and a really I guess, humble spirit to listen first, to build relationship, and then to say, well, how can we maybe transform this together? It can't be a top-down kind of process, right? It has to be a contextual process. That's how you build trust, and that's how transformation happens. And I think in institutions, like traditioned institutions like churches, especially for denominations who have existed for centuries, again, the default is stasis, right? And so, change is bad, tradition is good. And when you think in those binaries, the process of change can be slow and incremental and even cyclical, right? End up where we were 5 years ago. But trusting that the relationships and the people, that we continue doing the holy work that we're called to do, is really the stuff of what ministry is. And that, yes, there is revolution, there is deep change, and sometimes they're brought on by those shocks, right? Like COVID-19, environmental climate change has really shifted a lot of, we look at the fires in California and how those congregations have weathered those storms, literally. But it is that question of, how does change happen, and how can I best be suited as a leader within a particular context to help bring about that change? And sometimes, I have to say to students, maybe this isn't for you. Maybe you are that revolutionary who's going to sort of work to, dismantle the system in these really radical ways. But most of the time, change happens in these other ways.
Yeah.
They happen in these slow ways. They happen in these sort of incremental, cyclical forms. And we have to harness energies in particular ways to make change possible.
And the possibilities that you're naming of how to maintain tradition, take the beauty of it while still adapting to, like, sometimes a storm is dropped on your head and you can have all the tradition you want, but if you don't adapt and immediately have the muscles to adapt and change, you're going to cease to exist, right? In that moment, that if we are practitioners of listening, if we are practitioners of that humble posture, if we are practitioners of paying attention to who our actual people are, then we have the muscles necessary to navigate significant cultural moments. And especially right now, I think the muscle that has been revealed that has atrophied or has just been completely underdeveloped by the American church is the ability to have conversations around difficult issues and work towards reconciliation and work towards unity. Clearly, we have not developed those skills. We have not exercised those muscles. That part of the body of Christ has wasted away because the second these political polarization, these issues get politicized, our only response is increasing division.
Yes. And I think that is a product of the culture that we live in, right? What we see on the media is division, division, division. Different settings, different news media reinforce those kinds of divisions in many ways. And I think the church is especially poised to offer a different response, but we do need to figure out how to equip ourselves with the skills of listening beyond what the broader culture is saying to us. Again, churches that are rooted in community, that are rooted in trust. How do we cultivate and engender that trust in different ways is critical. I would argue that we talk about purple congregations, right? That, that are a mix of progressives and conservatives and everybody in between. I would say that most every congregation that I've ever encountered, but I would say most congregations in general are purple congregations. You may not have a full consensus anywhere. And again, that's not realistic, right? Like even in a sea of a very progressive United Church of Christ, right? That in many congregations that are part of my own tradition, there are folks with different beliefs. Now, they may not be as vocal about that, or they may feel silenced, or they may not, but they're there, right? Because diversity just is. And until we sort of begin to understand diverse beliefs, diverse experiences as strength rather than as weakness, and how do we build upon those and learn from each other and listen to one another, then we can't flourish as the body of Christ. And right now we have a culture that says difference is bad. We want to go back to this particular time when everything was the same, when everything made sense. We hear a lot of that language in some ways. Or we want to move into this world where our vision of justice, our one vision of justice is justice, right? On the other end of things. That's not reality because we are plural. We are multiplicitous as human beings. I mean, I have multiple identities as a human being.
Right.
How am I not going to expect a whole congregation of bodies to have multiple beliefs, practices that change and morph throughout our lives? And so once we begin to celebrate the diversity of how we've been created. And I think, looking at our natural environment around us is a really helpful perspective to say, well, how has creation flourished amidst diversity? How is diversity necessary? How is biodiversity necessary all around us? And how do we foster that? And how do we ourselves then think about, well, how do they rely on, how does a forest rely on the strengths of each aspect of that force? How do trees rely on one another? Well, how do we rely on ourselves in those same ways? How do we care for each other? And how do we celebrate who we are as different and not see it as something that's to be abolished?
Yeah. Well, my hope is that as you've been trying to figure out, okay, what are the adaptations people have been making in response to COVID and rapidly changing political landscape, right? We're looking at having to deal with climate change and its direct impact. moving to co-vocational, bivocational life, dealing with congregations with less resources, having to figure out how to have political conversations that they've never had before, people's identity shifts that are taking place within all that. Here are all these challenges congregations are navigating. My hope would be that what you just named is the outcome of living through these forced changes and forced conversations, is that we have a far different imagination for unity that is rooted in diversity rather than conformity, and that churches are going to emerge that have had to develop those skills that then can actually lead the way, that the next congregational trend 5 years from now when we talk is going to be, wow, what we saw emerge out of all of this was a lot of churches took this idea really seriously and developed a different way of being together, listening to one another. Pastors adapted their skills. And now we're seeing these churches that are not just have token diversity, right? That not just have like have one culture, but lots of people who will operate in that culture, but are actually multi-ethnic, deep political change, that we would actually see that as being the fruit that comes out of some of what we're experiencing now.
Yeah, absolutely. So part of me is really hopeful for that. I think we have the capacity to imagine beyond even what we can see at the moment, right? Around sort of intercultural, multicultural adeptness and beauty and how we relate with one another. I think there's this hope that I feel that especially in this time we need to come together and come together globally in some ways. On the other end, I'm a sociologist, and sociologists are realists too. And so I can tell you all the ways and all the studies that sociologists of religion have done to say that diversity is not possible, or it has not been possible yet. So congregations can perhaps only sustain one or two types of diversity at most, maybe class diversity and political diversity, maybe racial diversity and, sexual identity diversity, whatever that is, maybe one or two aspects of diversity. And we know that pastors who are serving in a context that's different than their own ethnic identity is a very difficult context to serve in.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of challenges and barriers, and their own roles and sense of self is often defeated or deflated in those places. And so I would say that there's a lot of work that the church needs to attend to. And at the same time, I do see spaces where adaptation is happening in some ways. So for example, I serve on the research advisory committee of the BTS Center. The BTS Center is the legacy organization of Bangor Theological Seminary, one of the former UCC seminaries. And their mission is preparing and nurturing spiritual leadership for a climate-changed world, right? And so they work with churches as whole to say, well, what is your calling and your vocation in this time around climate change? Who are you called to be? What are you called to do in the world? And there are examples of congregations who are working with indigenous tribes to figure out, and to understand, well, what is my relationship to the land and how do we nurture the land that we've been given rather than destroy it in our local context? There are congregations that are holding services, around climate change and working with other communities around the globe that have been directly impacted by climate change to sort of support those congregations. There's a lot, I think, in terms of potential, if churches really begin to look at, well, what is our vocation in this time? Because vocation isn't individual. Vocation is always mediated by culture and community. And so as a church community, what is our vocation in this time and in this place? And I think asking that sort of question is crucial in this time for churches. Not for, individuals, yes, but always communities, because the work happens in community. And there may be, two or three different sort of vocations or callings, but what is our work in the world? And in some ways that's freeing because then it's like, well, churches aren't meant to do and be all, and our church isn't meant to do and be all the things, but we're meant to be here in this context, in this place. And what is our calling
for this purpose and these
place?
People, right? We are for this purpose and these people, and we can embrace that and flourish in it, and accept the fact that other communities are going to have a different purpose that complements and is part of that.
Right. And that's I think that's the lie that modernity and our broader, sort of Euro-Western culture says, we have to be all these things. We have to do all these things. And we have to be an individual church that does these things. Well, no, also things are created through partnership. You need partnership. You need other bodies of peoples to do things. So all of that, I think, is the beauty that I see in the church and the potential of what is taking place in the church.
Amazing. I feel like we could go for another hour, but we've used a lot of your time. So Kristina, thank you so much for some of those insights and thoughts. It was really, I felt catalytic to my own thoughts and imagination, but I think people listening to this are going to go through and want to go back and find out more about some of these pieces. And I know the volume you talked about, we'll include the link for that. There's a free download you can read, talk about a lot of these trends within that. If people want to connect with your work or find out more about one of your programs, where would they do so? Where would they find you?
Yeah, they can go to www.iliff.edu. That's the Iliff website, and I've got a faculty page on there, and you can see stuff that I'm working on and publications that I've written, and you can also just reach out to me on social media as well. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of those things.
Fantastic. We'll include some of those links to get people, hey, maybe we can get some new students to show up out of this. That would be what a great outcome that would be.
That would be lovely.
Awesome. Well, Kristina, thank you so much for your work. It's really valuable to the church. I'm so deeply thankful. I have so many sociologists in my life. I don't know if people have this blessing that I do. I've got all of these sociologists in my life, and they add richly, not just to me, but to the church and to understanding the world around us. So thanks for being committed to the church and sociology, and using those gifts. It's a blessing to us. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Greg.
Thanks for listening to the Future of Faith podcast, produced by Future of Faith, featuring original music by Kedron Boston. You can learn more about sacred listening and find a host of resources at futureoffaith.org. While you're there, make sure to sign up for our newsletter that delivers cutting-edge resources and research right to your inbox for free. If you like the podcast, make sure to subscribe to our channel and to leave a review. This is the Future of Faith.